Hi, this is Corey Franklin with Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. And today we're going to talk about two nice Jewish boys who grew up on opposite sides of the Atlantic in poor neighborhoods, one in Brooklyn, one on the East End of London, and their experiences as children had a profound effect on their lives and on their accomplishments, and both of them rose to the top of their professions. We're going to start out with Maurice Sendak, who died recently at the age of 83, who was a renowned children's author and book illustrator, and whose book Where the Wild Things Are became one of the top-selling children's books of the 20th century, and along with Sendak's other works, led an influential revolution in children's literature. Here's a brief interview with Maurice Sendak discussing his 1963 classic, which was not originally well received.
Maurice Sendak, perhaps the most renowned figure in picture books, illustrator of A Hole is to Dig and the Little Bear Tales from the 50s, author and illustrator of the classic Where the Wild Things Are.
Wild Things was my first big book, full color and text being mine. And it was a big risk because as it was being done, people at the house already were shaking their heads. And the book was banned and it was terrible reviews. 2 years before librarians began to see that all the kids were taken out of the library over and over and over again.
Well, the book was about Max, a child who's sent to bed without his supper, who enters an imaginary world of monsters and forests, and it tells us a lot about Sendak's own background and what he was trying to convey. Maurice Sendak was a nice Jewish boy born in Brooklyn, and here he discusses a little bit of his early childhood.
I had my place in childhood. I was not a popular kid particularly, and I was not a sports kid. I wasn't playing stickball in the street. I wasn't riding a bicycle. But what I did do, which most of them did not do, was go to the movies. And I went to the movies so much because my parents if you went on a Friday night, you got a plate and a dish. And finally, if you went every Friday night, you had a dinner set, much of which I still have because my mother adored her blue dinner set. And my gift with the kids was telling stories. And I would get all on the stoop, and I would tell them the movie I'd seen. And then I'd invent parts of the movie, especially gruesome parts. And they wanted that from me. Tell us a story, tell us a story, tell us a story. So that's where I was allowed into the street group. That was my offering.
Sendak's early life was beset by sadness, by the Depression. When he was a young boy, the Lindbergh baby was kidnapped, which had a profound impression on him. When he was at Lafayette High School in Bensonhurst, some of his relatives perished in the Holocaust. And all of these things had a profound effect, which made his books something of parables. He was telling one story, a simple child story, and he was telling a more complex story in his books for children. The stories were about children's fears and their inner lives.
It's hard for critics, because there's a misconception of what is a children's book and what it should contain and what it should not contain and what the subject matter should or should not be. And primarily it is to be healthy and funny and clever and upbeat and not show the little tattered edges of what life is like. But I remember what life was like, and I didn't know what else to write about. When you hide another story in a story, that's the story I am telling the children.
An integral part of Mr. Sendak's books were the illustrations, which he also did. Interestingly enough, he was a window display person for F.A.O. Schwartz in the 1940s, in the late 1940s, and that may be where he got his talent for illustrating children's books. There's an interesting parallel there because L. Frank Baum, who wrote The Wizard of Oz, was a window display person for Marshall Fields in Chicago at the turn of the 20th century, and that may be where he got some of his inspiration for The Wonderful World of Oz and the illustrations he did along with the book he wrote. Here is Maurice Sendak talking a little bit about the importance of illustration in children's books.
An illustrator, in my own mind, and this is not a truth of any kind, is someone who so falls in love with writing that he wishes he had written it, and the closest he could get to is illustrating it. And the next thing you learn, you have to find something unique in this book, which perhaps even the author was not entirely aware of. And that's what you hold on to. And that's what you add to the pictures. A whole other story that you believe in, that you think is there.
Very difficult form. It's like balancing pictures with words. It's rhythm, it's syncopation. It's where you stop writing and start drawing. It's a continuous thread. Words, pictures, and it has a tempo, almost a metronome at the beginning, because why would children go through a book? So you got to catch them with your metronome right from the start, so they syncopate with the book.
Sendak did many other books. He did Bumbelardi, he did In the Night Kitchen, he did Chicken Soup with Rice. He was occasionally criticized because he would have brief flashes of children's genitalia in them, and that's one of the things that irritated his critics. But at heart, they were honest. They were children's books that children could relate to, that adults could relate to, and he remained in touch with childhood all his life. And he stated very frankly that we all remain in touch with childhood all our lives.
People say, oh, Mr. Sendak, you live with your child self, and you're like Peter Pan under a mushroom. And I say, how do you like to live with your psychotic ancient self grumbling and bumbling around in your belly? That's what it's like. You live with your child self. You have no choice. He is there lurking.
So we say goodbye to Maurice Sendak, the nice Jewish boy from Brooklyn, who became a revolutionary child author and illustrator. We're going to turn now to Vidal Sassoon, the legendary hairstylist who died recently at the age of 84. He not only revolutionized hairstyling, but he set up a number of academies in his name, and he turned the craft of hairstyling into a multi-million-dollar industry. By any standard, he was the most legendary hairdresser in the world. Everyone admired him. He was the creator of the 5-point bob. He was the creator of short hairstyles which were contoured to women's faces. And in fact, he did some men also, including the actor Terrence Stamp. But his ability to use geometric forms and short hairstyles and mold them in a specific way according to the person's face were legendary. He was a true genius. He was world acclaimed, and he was sought out by some of the world's most famous people. His beginnings were modest. He was a nice Jewish boy born on the East End of London right before the Depression. His father left the family, and his mother sent him for a short time to an orphanage. And as he recounts here, the orphanage did a lot to shape his future.
I think it helped me tremendously because you either gave in or you utilized the energies you had to overcome the difficulties. And if you could do that, I think it was a great help, especially the disciplines that I learned at the Henderson Town.
His mother led him into hairdressing during the war, almost against his will, and here he talks about how he opened up in the poor section of the East End at Whitechapel.
My mother, she was most persistent. She said she had a premonition that I should be a hairdresser. Now you got to remember, it's middle of the war. In Britain, the war was from 39 to 45. So we're talking about 41, 42. German Air Force is bombing every night, and you're sleeping in the shelters, which is the underground. And she said, this will be good for you. Learn a trade, learn a craft. Okay, Mom, I did what, you didn't know you was your mother in those days.
God, I certainly wasn't going to dig roads. I wasn't strong enough. But she got her way. She took me to get an apprenticeship with a man called Adolf Cohen in Whitechapel Road. And Adolf said it'll cost 100 guineas. I don't think people have heard of guineas anymore, have they? It was £1 and a shilling. And my mother said, I'm terribly sorry, we don't have 100 buttons. The boss said, well, then I can't do anything for him. And I started to feel very good about this. So I went to the door and opened it for my mother, and I ushered her through. And in those days, the kids wore caps, and I doffed the cap to the boss. He followed us in the street and said, you seem to have very good manners, young man. Start Monday and forget the fee.
He wasn't very good when he started out, but he soon learned.
I was a shampoo boy and not a particularly good apprentice. There were many apprentices in the salon, and I was just average. I wasn't anything special. When I first went in there, it wasn't because of the love of hairdressing. I knew nothing about hairdressing, and it wasn't my first choice. The girls were pretty, and it helped.
His hairdressing career took a backseat after the war to fighting the fascists in England from Oswald Mosley, and then a year in Israel to fight for Israeli independence. From the BBC4 Last Word.
Vidal rarely ever gets heated about most things, and he rarely says anything bad about anyone, but one of the things that really gets him fired up is anti-Semitism.
Vidal was 17 when the war ended. He was still styling hair by day, but by night he joined the fight against fascists in the East End of London. He teamed up with some Jewish former soldiers who called themselves the 43 Group.
43 ex-servicemen turned up for a meeting and said, "We're not going to allow fascists to walk around these streets. We've been fighting for 5 years." And they were tough. They were really tough. And they asked for volunteers. Not only Jewish guys. There were Christian boys that had seen the camps, seen the inside of the camps.
The concentration camps.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they let us know exactly what was going on, so we could ambush.
So what sort of ambushes did you get involved in?
Well, it was all street fighting, obviously. And every now and again you'd get hurt.
And so you'd hide and then they'd come marching past and you'd set upon them?
Well, if you've got tough ex-servicemen who weren't going to put up with it, fascism anymore, they weren't too hard to follow. I don't think I could have gone in on my own.
After he came back from Israel, he moved to Bond Street, and that's where the legend of Vidal Sassoon really began.
And it took 9 years of training people, having a wonderful team around me. And within 9 years, we'd gone from hairdressing to hair cutting, color, and cut and perm with no setting. I mean, it was total change. And it was very exciting, but it was gradual. I didn't get up and say, well, today I'm going to do this. It had to come, possibly it was cerebral. I think a lot of it was from the gut, the feeling of trying to do something that was special and different. Before, when I opened my first salon, I said, look, we've got to change the craft. Go to Chicago, Michigan Avenue, and see the buildings. Absolutely splendid. Hairdressing is way behind. Pretty, nice, but we've got to change it. And there was also a need for a respect, which we had to develop. In other words, you can't ask to respect somebody if they come to work in dirty old jeans and a torn shit t-shirt. So my guys wore three-piece suits. They really did, and in the summer they could take the jacket off, but they had the waistcoat on underneath. And they really looked the part. And slowly but surely, I think we've gained some respect.
By the late 50s, they'd achieved their success.
His first big break was doing a haircut on an actress, Nancy Kwan. And she was a very, very beautiful Asian actress who had very, very long hair, and he cut it all off. It was published in all the magazines in the world, so he was instantly global.
The boys wants the girls, while the girls wants the boys who want the girls.
God. It's Vidal Sassoon. It's very in.
What's wrong with you?
Do I look that bad?
He also did Mia Farrow's famous haircut when she was fighting with then-husband Frank Sinatra. Here's Matthew Bannister again.
You were becoming a star yourself, weren't you? I mean, this was a heady time in London. There were, people like Terence Stamp and Michael Caine were hanging out in London. The Beatles, of course.
Yes.
And, you were moving in those circles, weren't you, and becoming a bit of a rock star yourself?
Well, when I worked in New York, Terry and Mike stayed at my flat.
Eyes watch, girls walk.
There's a pride in being part of London. being part of that scene. Well, a humble pride, put it that way. But we used it. I was at the theatre all the time. One time we went back, I looked up, it's Laurence Olivier. And he came over and said, "What did he call you?" I said, "Vid, well, what's your real name?" "Oh, Vidal Sassoon." Olivier said, "Oh, you're that barber." I don't think I was a superstar, I was more of a dictator.
The most important thing was standards. And if you partied all night, you'd lose those standards. So at 11 o'clock, I would say, "See you, but the party's just starting." "Yeah, but I'm working early tomorrow."
And he maintained his lifetime fight against anti-Semitism.
No, I was a thinker because I'd realized that we've been the butt for most excuses for war.
Vidal continued to play a leading role in the fight against discrimination. Professor Robert Wistrich is director of the Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism, which he established in Jerusalem in 1982.
He divided the world at that time into two kinds of people. Those who were willing to kill Jews, as happened during the Holocaust, on the flimsiest of pretexts. And the other thing was those who had some compassion for Jews, and that compassion led them to a somewhat protective attitude. But what his point was that this wasn't good enough, that Jews had no choice anymore after the Shoah, but to take their fate in their own hands, and that they would have to be activated in their own self-defense. And I think this was an enormously important lesson for him. It explains why he chose to volunteer, which was an unusual thing to do for a young lad from London's East End to go and fight in Israel, risk his life. He always regarded that as a miracle, by the way. He always said, when he looks back on that time, which he defined that year of 1948-49 as the best time of his life.
Here's Vidal Sassoon reflecting on his life and his career.
I've had a fascinating journey. There was a time when I looked in the mirror and said, "Is this all happening to me? It can't be. It's too good to be true." You know, it was that good. And I'm very thankful for it. You know, it's very humbling, really. If I believed in something, I'd go straight for it. If it wasn't successful, I could always go to Barclays Bank and borrow some more money. Just really lack of fear. Go for it. Make it happen. You know, in every craft, they always say someone comes along who does something very different. Well, that's it. Nothing else can be done. But there's always something. There's always somebody with a new idea, a sense of creativity, you know, vision. If you do something, you do it well. You're still looking, well, can I do this again? Can I improve on it? There was a fascination that came with hair, although at the very beginning I didn't want to have any trust with it at all. But eventually a fascination grew, because it is the only substance that grows from the human form, that you can cut shapes and angles and do wonderful things with.
I think changing enough of the craft to give hairdressers something more to think about, something more to do, something more to learn. I honestly feel that if I went tomorrow, I would have done something worthwhile with my life. I honestly feel that.
Well, we'll miss Vidal Sassoon. I want to thank my producer, Sid Tepps, and in tribute to Vidal Sassoon, we're going to play What Else? From the Cowsills, A Little Bit of Hair, and Vidal Sassoon famous catchphrase.
I'm Vidal Sassoon. And if you don't look good, we don't look good.